The date is November 25th, 1863. After a wet, frigid night, farm boys will take to killing other farm boys on a hillside in East Tennessee. The young men are from Alabama and Texas, Illinois, Ohio, and Kentucky. They are part of a much larger army preparing for battle just west of Knoxville. The hill where it all will take place belonged to Knoxvillian Drury Armstrong. He owned great reaches of land south of the river. But it is the fight to come which locks the place name in history, Armstrong Hill. In the larger picture of the outcome of the Civil War, what happens next matters little, except to families in Texas, Alabama, Ohio, Illinois, and Kentucky.
Thousands and thousands of soldiers died in the Civil War in a situation where it would be difficult for their relatives who survived them to try to make sense out of that death and try to see that something important resulted from it. They often console themselves with the thought that regardless of the results of that particular battle, as long as my loved one died in a way that would make us proud or make him satisfied that he had done all he could against great odds, then we will be satisfied with that.
The Battle of Armstrong Hill flowed back and forth across the steep hill.
From that point on, there was extremely intense skirmishing for several hours that morning as both sides traded shots, and in a more or less static position down on the lower slopes of Armstrong's Hill and in this valley that we're standing in.
As many as 2,000 men on both sides were positioned to play a role. Charges and countercharges from each side ended in a stalemate. The steep terrain continually narrowed the Confederate attack and funneled it into a smaller and smaller front. They could not advance. The stalemate meant the Union position had held. In all likelihood, the political issues at the root of the Civil War never entered the minds of any farm boys on Armstrong Hill. Combat, after all, is a simple reality at the foot soldier level. It was cold. Others were trying to kill you, and you need to kill them first. The ultimate futility of the moment, however, does not diminish the sacrifice. The future of the United States of America, North and South, was determined through the bloodshed on both sides. The fact that a battle is little known and rarely studied does not lessen the commitment of the men who died here. The land upon which they fell is no less consecrated than the land of more famous fields such as Gettysburg and Shiloh. Death did not find one place more honorable than the other, and neither should we. This program is about the century-and-a-half-long struggle to hold on to the high ground south of the river in Knoxville. You will hear the words of the Civil War soldiers who manned the forts.
Our rations, meager at first, now became extremely small and of unwholesome and inferior quality. Those who served in the ditches fared worse. E. Tarrant, 1st Kentucky Cavalry, USA.
Many sought to develop the river ridges. Some failed tragically. Others were ignored. Then, 21st century development threatened to erase all of it. The East Tennessee Civil War Alliance presents Holding the High Ground, the long journey to save the ridgetops of South Knoxville. Because of the Tennessee River, South Knoxville has grown alongside, but somewhat differently than the rest of the city.
Real ancient oak tree. Oldest tree around here.
Monty Stanley's family has lived here since 1834.
Our family's always been involved in agriculture. Ever since they moved here. At one time, this was part of a 250-acre farm.
The river, always a barrier, slowed the movement of people, goods, and communication to South Knoxville. The area remained rural within sight of a growing city.
It hasn't grown as fast as other parts of the city for various reasons. There's a lot of rolling hills, which makes it a little more harder to develop. Maybe we can use that as our advantage, maybe to preserve a lot of the green space that we have left.
The Civil War would swell South Knoxville's population for a few years and at last bring a bridge, although temporary. Despite the fact Tennessee was a Confederate state, the majority of East Tennesseans had voted to stay in the Union. Many considered the Confederate troops in Knoxville an occupying army. Southern sympathizers were just as unhappy when Union troops marched into the city after Confederate forces left in late summer 1863. After a Confederate victory at Chickamauga in northern Georgia in October, General James Longstreet was sent to reclaim Knoxville. This is when the river ridge line of South Knoxville became very important. From a military viewpoint, these hills were the high ground looking down on the city. Artillery mounted on the heights could bombard the city and its defenses at will. Union engineer Orlando Poe recognized the importance of the hills. He set about creating defensive positions on their crests, even as Longstreet's troops positioned themselves and waited for the attack.
I slept last night in somebody's stable lot, under a large oak tree, with the moon straight over my head, and thought perhaps you and the children might be looking at it and thinking of me. John West, Texas Infantry, CSA.
Today, the military strategy is difficult to appreciate visually. Mature trees and undergrowth cover most of the site. However, if you return this landscape to the 1860s, every street of the small town is opened up to you. This is the view from a hill once known as Gobbler's Knob, and now as Fort Stanley. Fort Stanley was manned until the end of the war. This outpost on the side of a hill in Tennessee gave the soldiers living there plenty of time to consider their situation.
Lizzie, I wish you were here with me some pleasant morning or evening. The view is so grand on the north, and away off to the south you can see the Smoky Mountains. The mountains are snow-capped, but it spoils all for me to attempt a description. We have not much war news. Lieutenant James Steaker, 50th Regiment, Ohio Volunteers.
Directly across present-day Chapman Highway is Fort Dickerson. It is the only one of the three Civil War forts to have been protected as a park and is the most intact of the three. Guns on the high ground that would be called Forts Dickerson and Stanley were critical in stopping more than 4,000 Confederate cavalry under General Joseph Wheeler on November 15th. Longstreet had sent him to test the strength of the southern approach to Knoxville. When Wheeler encountered the high ground of South Knoxville, he thought better of the attack and returned to Longstreet's main force. On the next hilltop to the west stands Fort Higley. When the skirmish at Armstrong Hill took place on November 25th, the Union command realized they needed an additional buffer against the Confederate threat now coming from the west. Longstreet had placed artillery on the river bluff where the current-day Cherokee condominiums stand. Union engineer Poe selected a location within the site of Longstreet's battery and had troops frantically digging trenches and gun emplacements in less than a day. On the southern slope of that hill, a subtle cut of an old military road is still visible. No doubt the road was crowded day and night with horses and wagons delivering artillery and supplies to the hilltop. On November 29th, the guns on Forts Higley and Dickerson are credited with helping stop another Confederate attack on the south side. This second assault was a diversion only. It was intended to draw attention from the main attack on Fort Sanders north of the river. Fort Higley was named in memory of Captain Joel P. Higley, 7th Ohio Cavalry. Higley's remains have stayed in Knoxville. He is buried at the National Cemetery alongside a number of Union soldiers who fell at Armstrong's Hill and at the Battle of Fort Sanders. The Confederate dead of the siege of Knoxville are not so easily found. Many were reinterred throughout Knoxville, and their location has frequently been lost to history. After Longstreet's attack on Fort Sanders failed and his forces moved away, the pace in the fort slowed. Soldiers were mostly riding out the war and wondering about getting home.
I'm tired of Knoxville. It is very quiet here, but few soldiers now remain, but sufficient to garrison the place. James Steaker, Ohio Volunteers.
In the last year of the war, this high ground along the river was site to yet another milestone in U.S. history. It was an effort personified by soldiers of African descent. They were known as the 1st U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. The unit was established in February of 1864, and the ranks were filled with local African Americans. While their uniforms said regular U.S. Army, many commanders in the Union Army did not look upon them as valuable soldiers. They were issued obsolete weapons and struggled to establish credibility. Their leadership was all white officers who had volunteered for the position.
The company has been busily employed on fortifications in Knoxville. Owing to the unsettled weather during the spring, the health of the company has been bad, but is now improving. Lieutenant Colonel John Shannon, 1st United States Heavy Artillery, colored.
The regiment's main purpose was to provide labor to maintain the many forts in Knoxville. Most of them saw little, if any, armed conflict. They often fell to disease, as did all Civil War soldiers, no matter their color. Knoxville's National Cemetery holds the remains of a few of the 1,000 men who served in the unit. One cannot help but notice the tombstone of one soldier in particular. We know very little about the man, except that his first name is likely one he gave to himself, Freeman. Freeman Welsh died 1 month after the end of the war, a free man. The next 100 years did not change the look of the high ground along the south side of the river. Visions of what should happen to the ridgetops began to surface about 25 years after the war. Many saw the south side of the river developing into parks. In 1889, this idealized view of Knoxville shows Luttrell Park near Fort Stanley. It never became so grand. The financial panic of 1893 saw to that. Today, an empty Baptist hospital building sits on the property. One of the notable attempts to take advantage of the bluffs, the river, and the view of the mountains to the south was a cable car ride. Cables were strung from near the mouth of Third Creek to what was then called Longstreet Heights, today Cherokee Bluffs. There were claims the car rose 350 feet as it was pulled across the river. The fare was 15 cents. The local papers touted the view and landscape of the south side. The owners of the enterprise hoped to construct a park-like setting at the top. Unfortunately, on February 18, 1894, just 2 months after the opening, the cable that pulled the car up to the heights broke. The suspended car did not fall, but the violence of the incident killed 1 passenger and injured 2 others. The cable car excursion business ended shortly afterwards. The belief that the high ground along the river should be made into a park continued into the 1920s. A thoughtful and detailed proposal to correct Knoxville's street layouts, improve municipal buildings and services was presented to city fathers. Unfortunately, the proposal was presented in 1929, a short time before the collapse of the stock market. The Great Depression ended another hopeful approach. For good or bad, the high ground remained untouched.
My name's Morton Rose, and we established a summer home here in the early 30s, but the property had been in the family since about 1914.
The property the Roses owned was Armstrong Hill. Morton Rose Sr. was an industrious man. The owner of a lumber company in Knoxville, he transformed the place. Soon the spring-fed creeks became lakes, and crops were being raised on the level areas.
As kids, we had a great time out here. We didn't have to be Boy Scouts because we had all that facilities here. But as we go through the plowed fields after a rain, while we would find mini balls sitting up on little mounds of dirt. And that's basically the only thing that I really knew about the Civil War.
Despite Morton Rose's fond memory of the family property, he and his brother sold it in 2005 to a Georgia development company. The sale of the Rose property launched a series of development projects which clearly had available land on the South Ridge Line in its sights. When the first phase of construction finished, 1 parcel remained untouched, the place where at least a portion of the Battle of Armstrong Hill had taken place. The land on which Fort Higley resides went through various owners through the next 140 years. The last owner had plans to develop it as well. Some of the rifle trenches were destroyed and used as a dump, but for the most part, the fort is well preserved. In a surprising move, the Aslan Foundation, a Knoxville non-profit organization, purchased the property from a developer in 2008. Aslan board members had reacted strongly to the unrestrained development on the slopes and moved to save the hilltop and nearly 100 surrounding acres. 2 of the 3 forts were now protected. An archaeological survey was completed in 2009. With the help of satellites and lasers, the report shows the fort to be within a few feet of where Orlando Poe placed it on his map in 1864. The gun parapets and rifle trenches remain visible. They are likely the work of men such as Joseph Bodsey of the 1st U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. Company F maintained the fort after the siege of Knoxville. Fort Dickerson is currently a public park. After the war, the property had remained in private hands until 1935 when the city of Knoxville acquired it. It went untouched for the next 20 years. In 1955, the South Knoxville Rotary Club acquired surveying rights from the city and began a process that led to the Fort Dickerson Park that now exists. There were big plans for Fort Dickerson during the centennial of the Civil War in 1963. Mayor John Duncan announced private investors were interested in creating a tourist attraction with a chairlift. The plan never developed and the fort fell into a state of neglect. During the 1990s, the Knoxville Civil War Roundtable raised money to stabilize the eroding earthwork. Today, the city of Knoxville and the Roundtable maintain the site with historic interpretation and security. We return to Fort Stanley. During the war, its rifle trenches stretched to the east for hundreds of yards. Today, it has shrunk to a wooded hilltop and is the least well-preserved of the 3 forts. Like Fort Higley, it is marked by a blue water tower near its crest. John Thomas lives on the slope of Fort Stanley.
Years ago, when I first moved here, and I've been here 30 years, there used to be people coming up and do relic hunting.
Thomas has written a history of the development of this part of South Knoxville. He says houses were being built on the hill as early as 1883, but the fort was not touched. Things began to change in the 1930s.
Charles Sims developed the top of the hill. The stuff on Fort Stanley was probably intact until about 36 when they put the water tower in.
Miraculously, South Knoxville grew slowly to the east and south away from Fort Stanley. In December of 2009, the Legacy Parks Foundation announced it had purchased the former Rose property from developers for $1.4 million, most of the money coming from private donations. Armstrong Hill was preserved and protected alongside Fort Dickerson and Fort Higley. Legacy Parks, also a nonprofit organization, was founded in 2005. The foundation works to acquire land that expands parks and green space. After the land is purchased by the foundation, it then transfers the property to overseers who manage it. Typically, this is either the city or county government. Connecting Armstrong Hill, Fort Higley, Fort Dickerson, and Fort Stanley to Iams Nature Center through a trail system has been proposed. It is similar to the plan offered in 1929.
You're talking about a corridor that has historical significance, recreational significance, environmental significance. So it's hard to find an argument against all 3 of those.
The concept of an urban wilderness with bike trails and history hikes is an ambitious one in a good economy. The Panic of 1893 and the Great Depression of 1929 ended past plans for this area. Time will tell how the current recession will affect this new effort. In the meantime, the price for the Fort Stanley property, the last piece, is set at $800,000.
Stanley is really important to get that third of the 3 Civil War forts, and so we have a year to raise money to do that.
Dr. Carol Van West is director of the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area. He sees the acquisition of Fort Stanley as an important next step in presenting the larger picture of the Civil War in East Tennessee.